Hey, welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at the End of History, where we help believers make sense of the world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that built those times. So we're continuing our podcast series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. And today, we're going to begin our coverage of the American Revolution. These are the real stories and facts behind the myths that we ought to know about as we look into the fireworks this summer, as we're going forward. I hope you're enjoying this series as much as I am. And I think you're going to really enjoy these next few episodes as we look at the American Revolution, especially as it's really relevant to the season of, just what's going on in the world right now. So I guess without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode as we look at the terrible reality of revolution and what that really means.
This is the end of history.
Of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
I think one of the places we have to start at is just the reality that revolutions are a nasty business. In hindsight, we can often celebrate revolution, but in the moment, these kinds of events, these affairs, they're brutal, they're chaotic, violent, full of contradictions. And I'm not referring only to the American Revolution. I'm referring to all revolutions. If you look at the stories of revolutions throughout history, that's the reality. In fact, the American Revolution should probably be seen more as a series of revolutions, each one scaled down to lower levels of violence and chaos. That was honestly the way the first generation of Americans saw it. There was a revolution of independence from Britain, the revolution that established the Constitution, and there was the Revolution of 1800, as Thomas Jefferson and his followers saw it. That restored some of the aspects of the original American ideals in 1776. We're going to look at all that as we go along in this series. But for now, to really grasp what unfolded at America's opening moments on the world stage, we have to appreciate the reality of the chaos that revolution always represents. I think it's interesting that the U.S., the United States, while born in the fire of revolution, has possessed an attitude towards the revolutions of other nations usually marked by suspicion, caution, or even outright hostility. This tension between a national identity rooted in rebellion and a foreign policy wary of upheaval, it kind of runs through American history. From the earliest years of the Republic, American leaders distinguished their own revolution as a unique and almost sacred event, while viewing most foreign revolutions as dangerously radical, destabilizing, or ideologically incompatible. And that sense of moral exceptionalism had more to do with the self-deceptive nature of human nature than with the historical facts. Now, George Washington, he set the tone early. Watching the French Revolution descend into violence, this revolution that occurred just a few years after the American Revolution, he's watching it descend into violence. Americans are watching it descend into violence. And George Washington warned Americans against being entangled, this is a quote, entangled in the labyrinth of European politics. And in his farewell address, he cautioned that foreign revolutionary fervor could mislead public opinion. John Adams, the founding father, was even more blunt. He called the French Revolution a contagion that threatened to destroy every moral principle. Now keep in mind, these were references to a country that, had the French not helped in the American Revolution itself would have failed. So these statements reveal a deep anxiety that revolution abroad was not the measured constitutional struggle that Americans believed they had waged. It was something more volatile, something socially disruptive. Now, historically, America has often sided against revolutions rather than on the side of the revolutionaries. From Haiti to Cuba, all across Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, the U.S. is notoriously, infamously, pro-revolution in its ideals and anti-revolution in its policies. A nation founded on rebellion has often feared rebellion abroad. And yet this contradiction reveals something important. Americans have long believed their revolution, our revolution, was exceptional. It was an orderly assertion of rights, not a model for global upheaval. In defending that exceptionalism, the United States has frequently stood against the very forces that once gave it birth. You know? The American Revolution lives in the national imagination as a kind of civic scripture, a collection of stories that define who Americans believe themselves to be. And these tales, polished over the generations, they form the mythology of American exceptionalism. The idea that we are a people uniquely brave, uniquely principled, uniquely destined for freedom. And this is particularly true in our current moment as we celebrate our 250th anniversary for independence and for revolution. At the center of this story stands the image of the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord. Ordinary farmers. If you've been to any grade school history class, you know these guys. These are ordinary farmers who supposedly dropped their plows, seized their muskets, and faced down the greatest empire on earth. And the story is less about tactics, more about character. The humble citizen soldier who rises when liberty calls. The transcendentalist poet, Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was one of my favorites when I was younger. Ralph Waldo Emerson. He wrote a line years later, he wrote a line called "The Shot Heard Round the World." And it became a kind of national baptism, suggesting that American courage set history in motion. Emerson wrote his poem for the 1837 celebration commemorating the battles of Lexington and Concord in the American Revolution. Those are the battles we talked about in the last episode. This is what he wrote. He wrote, "By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silent sleeps, and time the ruined bridge has swept down the dark stream which seaward creeps. On this green bank, by this soft stream, we set today a votive stone, that memory may their deed redeem, when like our sirens our sons are gone. Spirit that made those heroes dare to die and leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare the shaft we raise to them and thee." Now, it's also worth noting right there, as mentioned in the last episode on independence, that when the poet wrote those words, it was really a unique time when American history was beginning to take on a religious quality to it. You can pick up on that in those lines right there. And we're going to talk more about that in a later episode. But it wasn't just Lexington and Concord. When we look at the legends of the American Revolution, we come to Valley Forge, where George Washington, stoic and unbreakable, he leads a starving army through suffering towards eventual triumph. And in the mythic version, the men endure not because they must, but because they believe. Washington becomes the archetype of virtuous leadership, the man who would have been king, but chose instead to be a servant of the Republic. There's also the midnight ride of Paul Revere, immortalized by the poet Longfellow, galloping through the night to warn a sleeping countryside. The poem's refrain, "One if by land and two if by sea." It's etched into American memory, right? Even though the historical details are really a lot more complex than that. It's not quite as simple as all that. What matters, though, is the symbolism, the vigilance, the courage, the idea that a single determined individual can alter the fate of a nation. That's the idea of American exceptionalism. That's the idea of the American Revolution. And these stories endure because they offer a moral drama in which freedom triumphs through unity, sacrifice, through providence. They're not the whole truth, though. Real history is far more tangled. But they express the inspirations, the aspirations that Americans want to see in themselves. They're the revolutions as Americans wish it had been, and thus the revolution that continues to shape the national soul. And at a personal level, these are the stories that I grew up on, the stories I enjoyed about America's history. The problem is they don't prepare you for the real costs of freedom and liberty. By withholding the unpleasant facts, the unpleasant truths from the story of America's Revolution, we fail to learn from mistakes that were made, and we fail to gain the opportunity to improve as a people. That's the real point of the study of history, right? The ideology should be secondary. No matter if it's the left's version or the right's version, what are the facts, and what can we learn from those facts to become better people, to become a better society? Now, prior to researching this series, when I thought of the revolution, I imagined bands of redcoat British soldiers calmly, if not foolishly, marching through a field against poorly clad American patriots fighting for their lives in a fight where the odds were stacked against them. I saw an orderly fight with occasional outbursts of violence, but on the norm, reasonable, balanced, and calm. That's the images, that's the paintings of the American Revolution. But as I researched this series, I learned that's not really the real story. This fight wasn't about clean lines on maps and stirring declarations, not for the people on the ground living in the reality of that fight from 1775 to 1783. On the ground, it was a messy, intimate, often terrifying civil war. That's what it felt like. That's what it really was at the time. Before it was a victory of the American Revolution, it was a civil war against Great Britain, colonists against Great Britain. The violence didn't unfold only on distant battlefields between uniformed armies. It seeped into kitchens, into barns, into forests and crossroads, pulling in men and women, patriots and loyalists, native nations, enslaved people, civilians who wanted nothing more than to just survive this storm. And what emerged was a conflict defined as much by chaos and personal vengeance as by the ideals of liberty. And that's important to recognize here, because these things were truly at play then. In many towns, the first battles of the American Revolution weren't fought against British regulars, but between neighbors. Loyalists or Tories, those Americans who remained loyal to the King of England, they found themselves dragged from their homes by American patriot committees, tarred, beaten, driven into the wilderness. Patriots in turn were ambushed by loyalist militias who struck at night, burning farms or kidnapping local leaders. Entire communities fractured in this war. A man would wake up a respected citizen and go to bed hunted by people he had known his entire life. Women were left to defend homesteads, hide food, negotiate with whichever armed group appeared at their door the next day, the next week. Native nations faced the most impossible choices. The Haudenosaunee, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, it split apart, with some nations siding with the British, others with the Americans. Their homelands became corridors of raids and counter-raids. Villages were torched, crops destroyed, families scattered into the woods. There was this Sullivan expedition of 1779 launched by the Continental Army. It marched through the Iroquois territory, burning towns and food stores, leaving thousands of native people facing starvation in this war. On the frontier, native warriors struck back with their own raids, targeting settlements that had pushed deeper into their lands. Civilians, women, children, the elderly, they were often the ones caught in the middle of all this fighting. In his book, The American Revolutions, the historian Alan Taylor writes, this is a quote, he says, desperate for fodder and food, both armies stole from civilians, ruining hundreds of farms and impoverishing thousands of people. On both sides, officers reasoned that any resources left behind would only fall to the enemy. But the worst looting and killing derived from the vicious competition of irregular partisans. Rarely paid, they sought compensation in plunder, which discouraged morality and restraint. They assassinated foes, executed prisoners, and looted and burned the homes of civilians caught in the middle. At night, both sides attacked houses to kill helpless sleeping foes in their beds or to haul them out for brutal floggings that would become fatal. Hundreds of desperate families became outliers, abandoning their homes to live in hovels secreted in forests or swamps. A North Carolinian reported fears of being called into the militia, that's the Patriot side of the fighting, has driven many to hide in the woods. And as they have done nothing on which to live, they resort to highway robbery. Bandits, gangs added to the chaos by preying upon everyone. Even formal battles were far from orderly. Muskets misfired, smoke choked the air, soldiers fought at distances so close they could see the fear in each other's eyes. At places like Camden and the Guilford Courthouse and Bunker Hill, lines collapsed into confusion as men stumbled over the wounded or fled into the trees. British bayonet charges shattered inexperienced militia units. Continental soldiers, desperate, undersupplied, sometimes broke ranks to loot wagons or search for food. Prisoners weren't always spared. Some were executed in the heat of battle. Others died slowly in overcrowded prison ships where diseases spread unchecked. Now, women endured their own forms of violence. Armies would strip farms of livestock and grain, leaving these families whose husbands had gone off to fight in the war, leaving those families destitute. Some women were assaulted by soldiers from either side, while others were forced to flee with children in tow, carrying what little they could. Enslaved people faced a brutal calculus: escape to British lines and risk betrayal, or remain with patriot masters who spoke of liberty while denying it to them. Again, this is another passage from Taylor's book. He says, the taboo against harming women broke down. In North Carolina, backcountry folks denounced the atrocities by the Patriot militia. Numbers of persons, such as women and children, have been tortured, hung up and strangled, cut down and hung up again, sometimes branded with brands or other hot irons in order to extort confessions for them. In Georgia, loyalists tortured a Patriot woman by using a musket lock as a thumbscrew. A French officer reported finding a pregnant Patriot murdered in her bed with a message scrawled on the bed's canopy by her loyalist killers, "Thou shalt never give birth to a rebel." These were the people who didn't live to see the birth of liberty and what America would become. I always think about that when I think of the people who died in the fighting, not even on the front lines. These were the victims. These were the ones that we just don't hear about. They just disappeared from the pages of history. They were the ones who didn't care about the ideas of liberty or believed it necessary to remain loyal to their king. That was their conviction, their principle. They died before it was ever determined how it would even end. For the people on the ground, the reality of the revolution, it was Armageddon. By the war's end, the landscape itself bore the scars. Abandoned farms, burned towns, graveyards filled with the nameless. The revolution created a new nation. But it did so through a conflict that was anything but clean, anything but heroic for the most part. It was a civil war layered inside a colonial war, or a struggle where ideals collided with the raw, unpredictable violence of ordinary people trying to survive a world turned upside down. Now, in our last episode, we saw how among the first tasks of the Continental Congress as they came to terms with independence was the formation of a Continental Army. To lead that army, they appointed one of the Virginia delegates. Of course, we all know George Washington. Now, George Washington is a historical figure loaded with extreme contradictions and paradoxes. Without a doubt, he was a white supremacist, okay? And I'm not saying that from a political perspective, from a woke perspective. I'm just looking at the historical facts. While leading the fight for freedom and liberty, he kept slaves. And he didn't just keep them, he went out of his way to preserve their enslavement during his lifetime. In the biography on Washington by Ron Chernow, he tells the story of how George and Martha Washington were in Pennsylvania after the Revolution, and they had their slaves with them. And a friend warned them that according to Pennsylvania's unique state law, if the slaves resided in Pennsylvania for 6 consecutive months, they would become free by law. Well, not sure if the slaves knew about this or not. Not sure if they knew about this law. George and Martha made calculated trips in and out of the state every few months with their slaves to make sure that their freedom wouldn't be secured. Now, that's pretty devious and not the image of the father of our nation that most of us think when we think of George Washington. It's also, I guess, it also wasn't a thing, I should say this, it also wasn't a thing where it's unfair to judge Washington by the standards of our day. He knew slavery was wrong. He wrote and spoke about it as wrong, but he never stopped doing it. During the war, some of his slaves escaped from his home at Mount Vernon. As Washington negotiated with British troops at the end of the war for their surrender, for the end of the fighting, he was also trying to get those escaped slaves returned to him as they had escaped over to the British. One of the famous stories that shines a big light behind the legend of George Washington is the story of one of his slaves, Harry Washington. Harry Washington was born around 1740 in the Gambia region on the continent of Africa. Harry was captured in West Africa, sold into slavery in Virginia, and George Washington purchased him in 1763, first assigning him to a project in the swamps before moving him over to Mount Vernon. Well, Harry escapes in the Revolution in 1771, or just before the Revolution. He was recaptured within weeks. His second chance, though, came during the American Revolution, when the British offered freedom to enslaved people who fled rebel masters and joined the British. Well, Harry Washington, he seized that opportunity. He escaped again in 1776, joined the Ethiopian Regiment of the British Army, and later served in the Black Pioneers working on engineering and artillery support for British forces. So George Washington's own slave is fighting against him in this war. Well, after the British defeat, Harry was evacuated to Nova Scotia with other black loyalists where they had kind of escaped to, where the British had put them. There he married Jenny, another formerly enslaved American. In 1792, he was seeking a more stable life, and so the couple joined this British-sponsored migration to Sierra Leone, where Harry became a landholder and community leader, but tensions with colonial authorities led him to join yet another 1800 rebellion where he was exiled and died soon after. Now, I just find this guy fascinating. This man, he's fascinating. This guy who most people had never even heard of was a participant in the American Revolution and the founding of two different nations via the slave trade and George Washington. And for years after the war, George Washington, kept tabs on Harry, thinking the opportunity might arise when he could recapture and regain his property. Now, that's a little devious if you ask me, especially for someone, the founding father, who's fighting in the name of an ideal where all men are created equal. At the same time, if there was ever an indispensable man to the American Revolution, it had to be George Washington. There were a lot of powerful and influential figures among the founding fathers, but from the era of independence to the era of the Constitution, no one played a larger role at holding the country together than George Washington did. And ironically, he did this largely on the strength of his character. Now think about that. The same character that supported white supremacy was also what helped to hold the nation together. Historical facts make American history far more complicated than we like to admit. That's just the reality of it here. Before he became the symbolic center of the American Revolution, George Washington lived a life shaped by ambition, shaped by discipline, and a constant struggle between his personal desire and public virtue. Born into the Virginia gentry, but not its wealthiest branch, Washington spent his youth navigating the insecurities of a man who wanted to rise in society. He cultivated the bearing of a gentleman, measured speech, impeccable manners, a fierce commitment to honor, yet he was also driven by a hunger for land, for status, for recognition. Washington was very ambitious in his youth and drawn to the aristocratic ways of life. When he was a teenager, he copied this book, or this guide sheet, I guess it is, a pamphlet, 110 Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. Now, these rules focused on how to handle one's self as a gentleman among the elite, which he was determined to become part of. For a good while, he was infatuated and he was obsessed with his neighbor and good friend's wife. She was known as Lady Fairfax. Even after he married his wife Martha, he and Sally Fairfax continued their correspondence. His early military career in the French and Indian War revealed both his promise as well as some of his flaws. Washington was brave to the point of recklessness, eager for distinction, and sometimes blinded by pride. His disastrous role in a skirmish and the subsequent surrender at Fort Necessity showed his inexperience, but his conduct under fire also earned him admiration. Now, these contradictions, bold yet insecure, principled yet ambitious, they would follow him throughout his life. His writings during the war were published in newspapers, frequently, this is the French and Indian War, frequently by Benjamin Franklin himself, so that by the end of the French and Indian War, Washington was, he was a bit of a celebrity in America. He was a homegrown colonist that the people could be proud of, and he actually attempted after the war to join full-time the British military. He wanted to go in as a full-time role to make it his career. And one of those what-ifs of history, the British turned him down, leaving him feeling pretty much just insulted by the arrogance of the British and their attitudes that they demonstrated to their colonists in that process. As a planter and a member of the Virginia elite, Washington embraced the world of tobacco, land speculation, and enslaved labor. He depended on slavery for wealth, even as he increasingly spoke the language of liberty. Now, this tension didn't disappear during the Revolution. It simply became part of the complex moral landscape that he inhabited. His marriage to Martha Custis Washington, and his inheritance from his brother and father, it really made him quite wealthy, but he was also pretty bad at managing money. He would overextend himself, getting into severe debt by the time of the Revolution. It's kind of strange. You'll find some historians who describe Washington as one of the richest men in America before the Revolution. Others will say he was underwater in debt and always anxious about going broke. And the truth is really somewhere in the middle. There's a phrase we use in the South that probably best describes Washington, his financial situation. He was land rich but cash poor. And by the 1770s, Washington had matured into a man of immense self-control and this quiet authority that he became renowned for during the Revolutionary War. His experiences with British military, their arrogance, their imperial policy, it really hardened his political views. He wasn't a fiery ideologue like Adams or Patrick Henry. Instead, he embodied steadiness. When Congress appointed him commander-in-chief, it was not for his battlefield genius. He hadn't built that yet. It was for his character. Washington's essential nature in the Revolution was symbolic. He was the unifying figure whose dignity, restraint, perseverance held the fragile cause together. In him, Americans saw the Revolution, and they saw the best version of the American Revolution's self, of themselves. And that was important. It was also one of the contradictions that Washington continued to carry. General George Washington, father of the country as he was called, even within his own lifetime, a guy who the American Revolution probably couldn't have succeeded without, he wasn't that great of a general. Another contradiction. In fact, in many instances, he wasn't even a good general. Multiple times throughout the war, he made really bad decisions. There were other generals who were more competent than him. Some of them, like Horatio Gates, even sought to replace him during the fighting. He had to wage a political contest to keep usurpers like Gates and Henry Lee from replacing him as a leader of the army throughout the fighting. And the fact is, if they had replaced him, even though they were probably more competent as generals, they probably would have lost the war because they lacked the image, they lacked the reputation, they lacked the character of Washington. What Washington brought to the war was not a great military mind. He didn't have one. He brought a strength of character that the morale of the Continental Army rested upon. I was watching the Ken Burns documentary on the American Revolution recently, and in one of the early episodes, they mentioned George Washington's surrender at Fort Necessity during the French and Indian War. And the commentator, or the narrator, says it was the last time he, George Washington, ever surrendered. Now, that's true, technically speaking. But the reality is that George Washington spent most of the Revolutionary War retreating and on the run with his army from the British. And the bottom line reality is that the British, they had to win. They had to win the war to defeat American independence. George Washington didn't have to win. And he realized this pretty early on. He just had to not lose. That became Washington's driving mission, and one that he only barely managed to achieve in the first few years of the war. For the first 5 years of the war, of the American Revolution, all of the fighting took place north of the Potomac River. And this was the heart of the radical country, right? North of the lands of Washington and Jefferson, and in the heartlands of the lands of people like John and Samuel Adams and Hancock, right? Well, in our next episode, we're going to dig into that fighting and the flow of the American Revolution. For now, hopefully, in this episode, we've erased some of the mythic legends and assumptions about what the war looked like. This brutal, chaotic age that seemed like Armageddon for the people whose homes and lands saw the bulk of the fighting. It was severe. They paid the price for it. And men like George Washington, as complicated as he truly was, managed to hold their vision and their steadfastness through to the end. I'm J.B. Shreve. You're listening to this podcast series, The Empire, a 250-year American story from the end of history, where we help believers make sense of the world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that built those times.
J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.